question 52. This is from the SAT number 9. This is April 2017. And question 52 says, Nicholas counters Martone's proposal about the evolutionary history of red and green algae by suggesting that the something. So there's a couple ways that we can approach this. So one, we're looking for basically Nicholas's objection or his counter to Martone's proposal about the evolutionary history of red and green algae. So there's a couple ways that we can solve this question. So one is that we can immediately go back to the passage, and we're basically going to look for what does Nicholas say when he's countering Martone's proposal. Basically, what is his objection to it? The second thing that we can do is that we can go and begin by looking at what is Martone's proposal about the evolution to begin with. And I actually recommend doing that first because it's going to help us solve this question more quickly, more efficiently, and make us more likely to get the right answer. This is kind of a challenging question because it does require us to have a pretty good deal of comprehension. So let's begin by looking for basically what is Martone's proposal about the evolutionary history of red and green algae. So we know we should be looking, maybe in somewhere in the vicinity of line 76 because of this question. This is the last question here, question 52. So probably somewhere around the end of the passage is where we're going to find what we're looking for. So down here, it's this paragraph here where Martone talks about what he thinks about the evolutionary history of red and green algae. And he starts by saying this here. So Martone's working hypothesis is that the molecular pathways which produce lignin, they emerged long before land plants evolved from green algae back to some shared ancestor. So basically this is him saying that he thinks that red and green algae, that they have a shared common ancestor, and that shared common ancestor could produce lignin, and it was able to produce lignin long before they separated. The other thing that he says is down here that he thinks that red and green algae, he's convinced that red and green algae descend from one endosymbiotic event when a eukaryote cell engulfed a photosynthesizing cyanobacterium and gained the ability to make its own food. So the second point he makes about the evolutionary history of red and green algae is that he thinks they descended from this one, what he calls an endosymbiotic event, right? And this event is basically when you have one cell which engulfs another cell. So you have two eukaryotes, and they pretty much in one becomes engulfed by the other. So this eukaryote cell engulfs a photosynthesizing cyanobacterium, and then it's able to make its own food. So this is pretty much what he thinks. He thinks that red and green algae descend from a shared common ancestor, and specifically that they descend from one endosymbiotic event. So now we can look kind of at what Nicholas says in contrast or as an objection to that. So he thinks first that Martone's evidence for lignin in this algae is strong. Then we get this word but, which is pretty good. That's what we want because we're looking for an objection or a counter. It says he thinks that red and green algae evolved from separate endosymbiotic events. So Martone thinks that they descended from one endosymbiotic event, and Nicholas thinks that they evolved from separate endosymbiotic events. Then he says still the progenitors of the two algae may have both carried genes similar to those participating in the lignin production pathways seen today. So basically both of those two progenitors, both of those two endosymbiotic events, or those ancestors that were formed by those events, they might have carried genes that were similar to producing lignin that we see in plants today or in algae today. So let's go down to our answer choices, and we're looking for one that's going to highlight this difference, in particular about this endosymbiotic event and about basically the shared common ancestors of these two types of algae. So A says that Nicholas counters Martone's proposal by suggesting that the major molecular pathways present in red and green algae must have been in place long before their evolutionary lines separated. So this is basically saying that Nicholas is arguing against Martone by saying, actually, the molecular pathways that allow for lignin production, they must have been present in some sort of shared common ancestor of red and green algae. So the shared common ancestor between these two algae must have been able to produce lignin. And this is not really, it's a point that Martone makes. So this is actually what Martone believes. Martone believes that there is a shared common ancestor that was able to produce lignin. So if Nicholas were to object by saying this, it would only support Martone's proposal, not really criticize it. Moreover, this is not really something that Nicholas talks about too much. He doesn't really make this case. So for that reason, it's not a really good answer choice because it wouldn't provide any sort of objection to Martone, and it's not a point that Nicholas makes. So let's get rid of A. B says that Nicholas counters Martone's proposal by suggesting that evidence uncovered in Martone's research does not directly address the issue of when the last common ancestor of red and green algae existed. So this is not really something or a point that we see mentioned in the text of the passage that we looked at. For this to be true, we would have to see Nicholas basically making the case that Martone, your proposal is not really that good because your research doesn't really provide enough evidence for us to say basically when they had this shared common ancestor. That's not the approach that Nicholas takes. Nicholas doesn't really criticize Martone for saying that his research doesn't address this issue. It's wrong for a number of reasons, but that's the main reason we can get rid of B. C says that Nicholas would counter Martone's proposal by suggesting that the evolutionary lines leading to the two kinds of algae might have diverged before they acquired the ability to photosynthesize. So this point here seems to make sense and match already what we know because it's talking about these evolutionary lines that were leading to these two kinds of algae diverging, right? So this is kind of what we're talking about. But we want to make sure that Nicholas would counter it by saying that they diverged before they acquired the ability to photosynthesize. And we should remember that when we're talking about photosynthesis in this passage or in this text, we're talking about photosynthesis in the context of this endosymbiotic event. So Martone says that there was one endosymbiotic event, and basically that was what allowed the shared common ancestor of red and green algae to photosynthesize. So that would basically mean this is a pretty good answer choice because Nicholas would counter Martone by saying that the evolutionary lines were already split between the two algae before they developed the ability to photosynthesize. Basically that each of the line that led to red algae and the line that led to green algae, they developed the ability to photosynthesize separately, or they had this separate endosymbiotic event, which is exactly what Nicholas says here, that he thinks they evolved from separate endosymbiotic events. So this is a pretty good answer choice. We should definitely keep it. Then we have D, which says that Nicholas would counter Martone's proposal by suggesting that the process by which this algae produces lignin might be different from the process by which ancestral species of algae produced it. Basically saying that the molecular pathways of some sort of ancestor of this algae produce lignin differently than the algae today produces it. But that's actually the opposite of what Nicholas says at the end of the passage when he says here, still the progenitors or the ancestors of the two algae may both have carried genes similar to those participating in the lignin production pathways seen today, he says. Or basically that the lignin production of these shared ancestors, these progenitors of the two algae, were probably pretty similar to what we have in present day. So that would make D an incorrect answer choice, and it's going to leave us with answer choice C for question 50.